Before we begin, I'd just like to say, caution, this video contains pronunciations that some viewers may find strange and disturbing. In my efforts to avoid using the anglicised pronunciation of Munch, as in Monster Munch, in favour of something closer to the original Norwegian pronunciation, I fear I may have accidentally pronounced the poor chap's name in just about every conceivable way possible, with the likely exception of the proper one. Apologies to Munch, the Norwegian language, and to yourselves as well if it particularly irks you, but with that being said, let's get into it. When Edvard Munch passed away in 1944, those tasked with the handling of his affairs were confronted by something of a strange scene. Highly regarded as a giant of modern art, Munch had achieved great success during his long life, and yet his last few years had been spent alone. Unmarried, childless, suffering from mental instability and living in fear of the Nazis who occupied his Norwegian homeland, when Munch left this world, it seemed to those who found him that he had done so alone. As they wandered through the hallways and bedrooms of the old painter's home, however, a different picture began to emerge. There they found artwork after artwork, canvases, drawings, paintings and prints, stacked in the corners, piled up in the hallways, covering the walls and even lying in the garden, exposed to the elements, like forgotten children's toys. All told, there were some 20,000 pieces found in Munch's home following his death, representing works from across his long career and a collection of near incalculable cultural value. To Munch himself, though, their worth was even greater than that, for in the eyes of this isolated elderly painter, these weren't just artworks, they were his children as well. Famously reticent to part with his works, and often likening his relationship to them to that of a parent to a child, he really did treat them in many regards as family. On good days, he would even take them to the beach. These somewhat odd behaviours were the result of a life shaped by tragedy, illness, death and loss, which had inspired Munch to create a new kind of art. One that was emotionally resonant, deeply personal and highly empathetic, leading eventually to the style that would generally come to be termed Expressionism. Today, we're going to take a look at Munch and his expressive art, his successes as a painter, failures in love, battles with addiction and struggles with the ever-looming threat of hereditary insanity, to give you a picture of a man who shaped the course of modern art and who may not have been as alone at the end as those who found him had thought. Munch is without a doubt best known for the Scream, though this ubiquitous image of modern anxiety is a far cry from where he started, as we can see from some of his earliest works, such as these self-portraits painted when he was just 19. They show us a rather serious young man with an already excellent grasp of brushwork and a bit of a flair for dramatic lighting. These portraits' naturalistic appearances are typical of 19th century Norwegian art, which was generally untouched by the rampant modernism unfolding in other parts of Europe. Norwegian painters instead focused mainly on landscapes and naturalistic depictions of their subjects. These landscapes, along with a lot of other Norwegian culture of the time, were created as part of an effort to establish a new national identity for Norway, which was seeking to gain its independence from Sweden. This was a task that Norwegian painters, inspired by their homeland's natural beauty, took to with great enthusiasm, painting spectacular works. Munch's works, however, would follow quite a different path, one which he was set on from an early age by a series of unfortunate events. As a child, he had seen his mother Laura die of tuberculosis, and soon afterwards he had contracted the highly infectious disease himself, spending much of his youth in a sickbed as a result. On top of this, his father, a military doctor and deeply pious man, appropriately named Christian, who by all accounts had been a good parent until Laura's death, soon afterwards began to show signs of mental instability. One moment he would play with Edvard and his 4 siblings as though he were a child himself, telling them jokes and reading them stories from their favourite author, the American Edgar Allan Poe. The next, he would fly into a violent rage, pacing the room, rambling about God, religion, this life, and more often than not, the next. To compound this trauma, Edvard's siblings were not spared either. His older sister Sophie, who had taken their mother's place in caring for him, also died from TB when Edvard was just 14, and most of his other siblings faced similar ends, from untimely deaths to mental instability. Speaking of his childhood, Munch would say, "Death and insanity were the black angels on guard at my cradle." Against all odds, however, he somehow managed to survive his childhood and entered the Royal School of Art and Design in Christiania, now Oslo, in 1881. Christian wasn't mad on his son's decision to study the unholy trade of painting, as he put it. But paternal ire notwithstanding, Edvard got on quite well in the school, showing great aptitude for the techniques and methods of painting. More formative than his studies, however, was his introduction to another Christian, Christian Krogh, a painter who, unlike many of the more parochial Norwegian artists of the time, was deeply in touch with what was happening in the rest of Europe. Particularly in France, where the realism of Courbet and the advances of the Impressionists were proving to be game changers. Krogh brought these new styles back to Norway, where he published a journal advocating them, which in turn encouraged the young Munch to give them a go. In works from around this time, such as Morning and Girl Kindling a Fire, we can see this impressionist influence in the soft diffuse glow of the light that warms the figures, as well as touches of realism in their everyday, banal subject matter. As beautiful and precocious as these works appear to us now, they were of course at the time perceived, as Impressionism often was back then, as ugly and unfinished. Munch, however, was not deterred. He was quite taken with this new style and its focus on everyday reality, though he wanted to apply their principles in a slightly different way. What if, he may have mused, we were to use Impressionism's focus on a moment not to record the passage of light, nor the slowly rising tide of social isolation, but instead to record a more personal subject, a moment of emotion or a deeply felt experience, captured in paint as the Impressionist had captured the modern world itself. A suitable subject for such a work soon suggested itself in the memory of his sister Sophie's death. The sick child, as the work became known, is, as a result, quite a haunting image. Unlike the rapid-fire works of the French Impressionists, which are often done in an afternoon, Munch spent over a year on this piece, working and reworking, adding paint and scraping it back, tirelessly excavating the surface in search of a representation of the moment that he saw in his mind and the feelings that it conjured in him. The resultant work bears the marks of this process. Its blurred, scratchy and deeply worked surface shows Sophie sitting upright on the verge of death, with another figure, their Aunt Karen, comforting her. The composition, as well as the motive, is strange for the time as well. If we look back at other examples of paintings featuring a person near death, they usually range in character from maudlin dramas to elaborate circuses of grief, while this one, by contrast, feels much more personal. This is no great general or mythic hero who dies, but a family member instead. The view is cropped close to bring us into the moment, and Munch uses contrasts of both colour and tone in some striking ways. Sophie's skin, for example, is so pale that it nearly blends with the pillow behind her. She appears almost translucent, and the light in the scene, rather than being a naturalistic part of the painting's world, instead seems to emanate directly from her pale features. The lack of contrast between her and the sheets also plays against the encroaching blackness which Sophie stares at, as if she can see the end approaching. This stark opposition evokes heightened emotions and suggests the transition between states of life and death. The colour contrasts too add to this heightened emotional value to increase the visual tension. The red of her hair is set against the green of her dress, while the traces of yellow and blue worked into the whites around her further push the chromatic and thus the emotional intensity. While this work contains elements of both Impressionism and realism, instead of just capturing a moment, Munch is asking us to feel it instead, to empathise with Sophie at the hour of her death and to convey the grief and loss that he felt. Asking a 19th century art critic to feel empathy for others was, however, a bit like showing a dog a card trick, and so the response to what would become Munch's breakthrough work was, of course, a little underwhelming. One criticism levelled against him was that it looked, once again, unfinished, while another was its lack of convincing natural light and space. Munch, like many modernists, would face an uphill struggle with the critics, but luckily for him, Christian Krogh came to the rescue once again, when he introduced Munch to some folks who, unlike the critics, were quite willing to embrace new ideas with open arms. The radical anarchist social circles of Christiania's Bohemians. Led by the charismatic self-proclaimed nihilist Hans Jaeger, the Bohemians embraced all that was new and scorned the traditional. As anarchists, atheists and general nonconformists in a highly conservative religious society, they advocated, amongst other pursuits, free love and polyamory, cutting ties to one's family, causing scenes in the theatre, and never smiting your neighbour, for a sum of less than 5 crowns. Not to mention copious amounts of drinking and the occasional spot of public brawling. Despite his religious upbringing, Munch was totally on board with much of this, including one Bohemian commandment that resonated with him in particular. Thou shalt write thine own life. Now, in fairness to the Bohemians, a lot of these prerogatives are nonsense, falsely attributed to Jaeger by his enemies as a joke, which, given his general attitudes, I'd say he probably quite enjoyed. The part about writing your own life, however, is fairly accurate, as the Bohemians were big fans of free expression above all else. And while for Jaeger this basically boiled down to writing raunchy novels about sleeping with prostitutes and committing romanticised acts of suicide, for Munch it became a framework that would free him from any need to conform to the established styles of painting. Jaeger advocated a process he called spirit journaling, writing out one's life story and engaging in a process of internal assessment, which Munch undertook fastidiously. This is where writing becomes a part of Munch's practice. In his many notebooks, in addition to studies for later works and quick sketches of sights he saw in his travels, we can also find many notes and written passages articulating his ideas and feelings as well. This use of the written word would form an important counterpoint to his visual studies, one that played a large role in turning the young artist's eye away from the external world and ever more towards his own internal emotional state. During this period of Bohemian revelry, Munch painted portraits of his friends, such as this excellent likeness of Jaeger himself, or this piece showing his sister Inger sitting on the shore, works which continue to show the influence of Impressionism, but there is something else to them as well. A pervasive sense of loneliness and distance. The figures are usually presented alone or apart, and their contemplative moods convey a kind of pensive anxiety, perhaps reflective of the mood of Munch himself, who, despite moving freely in Bohemian circles, was never fully at ease with their anarchistic beliefs, due to his strict religious upbringing. One interesting character of many of these works is the ever more loosely defined spaces that these lonely figures inhabit. Munch seems to care less about the physicality of his pictorial space as he becomes more interested in the feelings and emotions that no such illusionary space could ever possibly contain. Refining his style and gaining followers thanks to his association with the Bohemians, Munch had his first solo show in Norway in 1889, which was well enough received, with perhaps a little help from Christian Krogh once again, to merit him a scholarship in Paris, where he was to study drawing under the great master Léon Bonnat, an honour which Munch described as mind-numbingly dull. Luckily, Paris had more to offer than the studio of Bonnat. There he saw the works of Vincent van Gogh, as well as those of the Impressionists Krogh had evangelised up close. He even painted his own versions of their works in the style of Pissarro and Seurat. The painter who had the biggest impression on him was the terror of the South Seas himself, Paul Gauguin, whose inimitable works were being sent back from his purported island paradise, capturing the imaginations of all who saw them. Gauguin's symbolism, syntheticism, clissonism, or whatever he was calling it that week, with its clear division of form and colour, rhythmic lines and layering of symbolic and observed realities, appealed greatly to Munch, and unlike the Impressionists to whom he had come as a student, he approached Gauguin with the confidence of a highwayman, taking from him exactly what he needed in terms of both inspiration and technique. Gauguin, who as a bit of an artistic highwayman himself, would no doubt have been proud. Munch's time in Paris was formative in many ways, though the most important of these had nothing to do with the Parisian atmosphere. It was instead news from back home of the death of his father. Shocked and unable to return in time for the funeral, he instead retreated into solitude, ruminating on his loss and his father's deeply held religious beliefs, which he himself had all but abandoned under the tutelage of Jaeger. In this piece, Night in St. Cloud, painted the year following Christian's death, we can see Munch once again channel his own personal experiences of death and grief into his painting. The dark space of the room, defined only by the light which enters through the window, creating a suspiciously significant cross upon the floor, conveys a sense of the unknown. Outside, the night sky exudes an impressionistic influence, evoking Monet's instigative impression sunrise. Dwelling in this darkened space, framed by illusionistic trompe-l'oeil curtains that invite us in, is the silhouette of a man who gazes from the dark at the world outside, evoking distance, isolation, and a Kierkegaard-esque Dark Night of the Soul introspective quality. As far as expressions of grief go, this work is, like The Sick Child, once again pretty reserved. Its predominantly cool colour palette doesn't evoke any outbursts of emotion. Instead, it feels like a silent meditation on the nature of life and death, elucidating on the transition between this world and the next that had so obsessed Munch's father in the throes of his madness. While it borrows heavily from the Impressionists, more so than Monet, we can see the influence of Gauguin at play, as Munch uses the elements of the painting itself, its silhouetted form, sombre colour and uncertain space, as symbolic vehicles, layered over the work's reality to convey his feelings, showing just how well he had internalised the lessons of Gauguin. This piece would prove to be a turning point, resulting in Munch writing what would become known as his St. Cloud Manifesto, because you can't be a good modernist without a good manifesto. This begins to outline what will become the focus of his work from here on out, part of which reads, "There should be no more pictures of interiors, of people reading and women knitting. There should be pictures of real people who breathed, suffered, felt, loved." What he means by this is that no longer would he paint impressionist scenes of daily life. Instead, he would create works that would show more than just how people looked, They would show us how they had felt as well. While his practice was undergoing some pretty radical developments in Paris, he had yet to achieve any great success, either critically or financially, though little did he know, some pretty powerful players were conspiring to give him just the chance he needed. In 1891, the Berlin Association of Artists invited Munch to show his works as part of their annual exhibition. And what's more, he was to be granted the honour of a solo exhibit, the first such show in the association's history. This honour had come about as a result of a bit of a craze for Norwegian painting among the association's committee members, many of whom admired the naturalistic landscapes of the Northern School. The prior year, Munch had been excluded from a contingent of Norwegian painters who had been invited to show their works, and this year, having heard of his studies in Paris, the committee sought to rectify this omission. Expecting perhaps some nice pictures of a few fjords and maybe a raunchy Parisian cafe scene or two, when Munch arrived with some 55 works in tow, they were in for a bit of a surprise. Munch's paintings were, by now, far more modern than what the committee had expected, and many of them shocked the organisers, who hadn't actually seen his works when they offered him the show. Pieces like The Sick Child were lambasted once again for their unfinished character, while others, like The Day After, featured a subject so scandalous, a hungover woman, that an outcry seemed inevitable. This resulted in the closure of Munch's show after just 1 week, and actually caused a group of artists, led by Max Liebermann, who would later become a friend of Munch's, to secede from the association and form the Berlin Secession, kicking off a string of similar movements across Europe, including the Vienna Secession we've been covering in the last few videos. While the critics foamed at the mouth, and the newspapers, apparently lacking anything better to do, actively debated the value of Munch's art, the man himself was quietly amused with the whole affair, describing it as most enjoyable in a letter to his aunt, and remarking that he couldn't believe all the controversy had been caused by something so innocent as a few paintings. He elected to remain for some time in Germany, and his works were put on show in other cities and venues, thanks to support from the German art dealer Edvard Munch, receiving more acclaim as they went, until the following year when they returned to Berlin, this time to a much warmer reception. He had finally found critical success, but it came with more honours than gold, as he put it, and the sales of his work were still infrequent, a trend which was perhaps not helped by his increasing unwillingness to part with many of his favourite pieces, likening his relationship to them to that of a parent to a child. As you can no doubt see from many of these works, this is where Munch's recognisable painterly style begins to emerge. So now is probably a good time to discuss how he handled his paint in this more mature stage and why. First and most noticeably different is his use of colour, which is often daring, high-key, and at times can take up acres of canvas real estate for evocative effect. Munch's sense of colour is rather strongly developed, and if we look closely at many of these works, despite the competing unnatural hues, we often find that they are balanced against each other quite delicately, at times achieving harmonies that work where all common sense says they really shouldn't. The application of all this high-intensity paint is done chiefly in two ways: large washes of thin paint that provide atmospheric colour while revealing layers in canvas underneath, and thicker, meandering lines layered on top, often used for emphasis of forms or to encapsulate and delineate a shape. Munch was some man for drawing with his brush, and these outlined shapes that anchor many of his compositions were carefully considered in his preliminary sketches, and drawn with even greater deliberateness into the final versions. These outlines and flares of colour would become ever more advanced as he develops as a painter, becoming more loose and daring in their descriptions of his subject as he goes. Speaking of subject matter, that's one area where there is little change from his early works, with figures and landscapes being his favourites throughout his career. The way his handling of the human form changes over time, though, is of particular note, as in them we can see his tendency to use unnatural colours and heavily outlined shapes become particularly pronounced. Carefully modelled faces are replaced with even tones and blocks of colour, and illusionistic 3D forms are ignored in favour of more graphic, readable shapes and outlines. Less realistic, yes, but also much more evocative of the emotions he was trying to convey. Now a successful painter who was paradoxically unwilling to sell his works when people actually wanted them, Munch embarked on what may well have been the most productive period of his career, painting many of his most famous works in Berlin throughout the 1890s, including everybody's favourite, The Scream. I'm not going to go into too much depth on this well-known work, mainly because everybody else already has. You can't swing a proverbial cat in discourse on Munch without hitting an insightful commentary on this most famous of his works, so you probably don't need me reiterating the whole spiel about him being gripped by terror at the sight of a crimson evening sky and feeling an infinite scream course through nature, even though it is bloody good stuff. In all likelihood, you'll have heard it all before, so instead, perhaps some mindless trivia will do. There are in fact some 4 versions of The Scream, 2 pastels and 2 paintings on cardboard, which is not the best for conservation purposes as you might imagine. Munch also made a lithograph version in 1895, but we'll get to that in a minute. and it served as the cover of more than a few books on the subject of art and mental illness, cementing its status as the image of modern anxiety. Also, I don't usually gawk at prices, but in 2012, one version of the Scream sold at auction for almost $120 million to wealthy financier of private military companies, Leon Black, a man so evil he leaves cloven hoof prints and the smell of brimstone wherever he goes, which is a fact that certainly makes me want to scream. One more bit of trivia regarding this famous image is that it is not, counter to popular perception, a standalone piece, but rather is part of a larger series of work that will come to be known as the Frieze of Life. The Frieze of Life contains quite a wide variety of subjects, as you might expect from the name, with many of them reflecting the modernising world Munch lived in, such as the city streets full of haunting faces that prefigure the Scream, as well as the remnants of the old world that had touched his childhood, like the ever-close-at-hand spectre of death that visits old and young alike in works like Death in the Sick Room and the haunting Dead Mother and Child. It is, however, the depictions of love and romance in the series that really steal the show. In these works, Munch shows us a very personal side of himself, his emotionally fraught dealings with the opposite sex, which offers us a view of Munch's own mindset, and the inner turmoil that was so often the fuel for his work. Between an insane father and everyone else around him dying of TB, it seemed that romance had never been a major part of the young Munch's life, but his association with the free love espousing Bohemians had changed all that. Encouraged by their laissez-faire attitudes to both love and marriage, Munch had, at the age of 21, embarked on an affair with the wife of a cousin of his, whom he refers to in his writings as Frau Heiberg, real name Emily Ilinthalo, or Millie for short. While initially excited by the affair, Munch soon came to a startling realisation that Millie, much more experienced in such matters than he was the one to hold the power in their relationship, as he found out when he approached her in the street one day, only to be rebuked as a fool for compromising their secrecy. To further complicate matters, Munch's religious upbringing also led to him feeling remorse and guilt for the sin of adultery he was committing, though not enough to stop apparently. The affair continued on and off for some years and ended up being the cause of much mental anguish for Munch, which luckily was exactly what he needed for his work. In this piece, Love and Pain, more commonly known as Vampire, though he never called it that himself, Munch shows us just how he must have been feeling. The two figures placed centrally within an ominous dark void show more traces of impressionist brushwork, but now it is being used not to describe reality, but to denote an emotional state instead. The man, curled horizontally in his lover's lap, evokes surrender and even a fetal-like dependence. Meanwhile, the woman is all-encompassing. She surrounds and cradles him in a manner that is at once both comforting and maybe unsettling. Her vivid red hair trickles down over her lover's face like rivers of blood, evoking the idea that she feeds on him, like the titular vampire. Munch, for his part, said that this work shows a woman kissing a man on the neck and didn't know where the rest of that was coming from. Or so he claimed. Another work, titled Ashes, shows the couple facing a moment of crisis during a secretive liaison in the forest. Munch himself is lost in despair. Clutching his head and coloured in cold blues and blacks, he conveys emotional distress that weighs so heavily it's practically dragging him out of the picture. Meanwhile, Millie clutches at her own hair, probably wondering what to do with the moany git she's stuck in the woods with, or, more likely, revelling in her own sexuality, whereas he cannot. Contrasts of black and white and warm and cool are used once again to convey heightened tensions, and the difficulties of their relationship in this moment, summarised by Munch in later versions where he adds the quote, "I felt our love lying on the earth like a heap of ash." One last work on the subject of love from this series I cannot pass by without mentioning is this one, Madonna, a rather striking image that may well hold a distant second place in terms of most recognisable works by Munch. This piece is commonly thought to be an inversion of the iconography of the Virgin Mary, and as such, it's a good deal less virginal, showing the figure in an unmistakable state of ecstasy. The viewpoint is intended to put us in the perspective of the man she is making love to, and her pose can be read as either a dominant expression of her power as a fin de siècle femme fatale, or as a more conventional depiction of female submission, owing to her hands being placed behind her back. Either way, the light coming from above recalls the convention of a light from on high, as in traditional depictions of the Annunciation, and the halo behind her being coloured in red further links the figure to depictions of Mary, though in such a way that would probably have had Munch's da spinning in his grave. A later print version of this work also features in no uncertain terms a border of sperm-like symbols and a tiny fetus in one corner, prefiguring similar, although much less graphic, devices used by Gustav Klimt the following decade. The model for Madonna, like in the other works mentioned, was another woman Munch had a relationship with, one Dagny Juel, who was a rather interesting figure on the Bohemian scene in her own right. Dagny became embroiled in a soap opera-style love triangle between Munch and his friend, the Polish author Stanisław Przybyszewski, an affair which ended poorly for Munch when Dagny chose Stanislas over him. Heartbroken for a time, Munch eventually resolved to grant the couple, who were after all his friends, his blessings, only to find Dagny had been murdered by yet another lover not long afterwards. With relationships like this, perhaps it's no wonder this series finds its culmination in The Scream. Many of the works from the Frieze of Life would become well known, and they earned Munch a new degree of fame and respect amongst the avant-garde circles in which he moved, though his love life remained a source of constant stress, and it was far from the only one. He was also broke, skirting bankruptcy and homelessness on more than a few occasions, and to compound this, he was ever more reticent to part with many of his more in-demand works, especially those that were part of the Frieze of Life, as he intended them to be seen together as a group. In search of a way to overcome this, he painted multiples of many of them, some for sale and some to keep, a practice he maintained throughout his career, though one which, as you can imagine, was not very efficient. And so, he turned for a solution to a medium more suited to the task: printmaking. Printing had come a long way from the days of Gutenberg, and it offered Munch a new way to create multiple copies of his works in a much quicker space of time. Not being a printer by trade, of course, he required assistance, which he found in the form of Auguste Clot, a renowned printer in Paris who had produced prints for such notable figures as Toulouse-Lautrec, Auguste Rodin, and Vincent van Gogh. Clot played a huge role in the modernisation of the printing process, and he worked closely with Ambroise Vollard, the dealer who had championed many modern artists, including Paul Cézanne, to produce prints and catalogues of their works. With Clot's help, Munch undertook a series of experiments in printing techniques, including dry point and aquatint, lithography, and woodblock methods. These prints frequently recycle compositions from his paintings. By taking advantage of his previous body of work, he freed himself up to focus on exploring the new medium, which he did quite rapidly. In just the space of a few years, he produced a huge amount of work, combining old motifs with new ones by means of reworking the printing plates and even altering some editions of each print by hand. He even came up with a new method of colour woodblock printing. Woodblock prints, as popularised by Hokusai and the lads over in Japan, were, to put it mildly, a pain in the arse to print in multiple colours, as you needed an extra copy of the entire block for each individual hue. Munch, however, found a way around this, sawing the woodblock into individual sections of the jigsaw to increase the ease of using multiple colours, an effect we can see in editions like this one, which takes advantage of the process. Another interesting quirk of Munch's printing habits was his embracing of texture, especially in the woodblocks, where he encouraged the grain of the wood to show through in the final print, even leaving the blocks themselves outside, exposed to the elements, to encourage the development of unique natural textures. Munch's ventures into print helped him achieve financial solvency for the first time. They even introduced works like The Scream to a wider audience too, the print version being much more widely seen than the paintings themselves. All told, Munch produced some 850 plates, from which about 30,000 editions were made during his career, and, in a strange but telling move, he often kept the plates from which these prints were pulled. Most artists who print get rid of these when they're done. Munch, however, had a collection of some 500 of them that were found in his home following his death. Munch's prints in particular would become highly influential in Germany and go on to inspire a whole generation of artists who came after him, many of whom would identify under the very loose banner of Expressionism. These Expressionists were a diverse bunch to say the least, but some of the commonalities they share included an emphasis on highly emotional subject matter, the use of strong and unnatural colours, and a general ambivalence towards conveying any kind of actual reality. All of which we can find an origin for in Munch. Of course, he wasn't their only inspiration. Expressionism was also, as with all modern movements, informed by the changes brought about by the modern era itself. Electrification, urbanisation, class conflict, the rise of the factory and the birth of the machine, all of these were leading to radical changes in Western society that were soon to be reflected in its art. One person who saw this and had his own ideas about what was causing it was the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who would also be a big influence on many Expressionists, and even on Munch himself. Nietzsche had a lot to say about a lot of things, but in regard to art, he thought that if we wanted to understand what was going on, we had to have a look at the past, and not just back to Goya or Courbet or whoever, we had to go way back. The ancient Greeks, as Nietzsche outlined in his work, The Birth of Tragedy, believed in many gods that governed their lives. These gods, jealous, feuding, petty little deities that they were, had to be worshipped in tandem, none more so than another, lest they become envious and seek to exact revenge. And so, in their art and their lives, the Greeks had looked for balance, particularly, when it came to art, of the Apollonian, the order, reason and logic of the sun god Apollo, and the Dionysian, the creative, indulgent and altogether much better crack worship of Dionysus, the god of wine, festivals and fertility. For Nietzsche, who was also busy announcing the death of the one god that was left in his own day, this pantheistic interpretation is rather interesting. And in some ways, it certainly does seem to describe what was happening at the time, and especially what was to come. As society under modernisation became ever more rigid, rational, and Apollonian, as it were, the art of the academies, itself the very image of the sun god's order, was ever more noticeably lacking in emotional depth. There was no room in its mature hierarchies and inflexible standards to express the Dionysian creative spark, and as such, the balance had to be redressed elsewhere. In the emergence of artworks that were expressive, emotive, indulgent, individualistic, and above all, human. Artworks which embraced the Dionysian side of life, and which would generally come to be termed, in one form or another, expressionist. The Nietzsche lad is pretty good, and when it comes to anticipating the changes of the modern era, as far as I'm aware, he seems to be pretty on the ball about a lot of things, which probably doesn't bode well for us in general. I must say, however, that I'm by no means any sort of Nietzsche expert. Most of what I just said comes from his early works, and Nietzsche, like the rest of us, changed his mind about a lot of things, including art, as he went on. On top of that, he is notoriously difficult to read and quite open to interpretation, so if you indeed happen to be a Nietzsche expert and I got any of that egregiously wrong, please do let me know in the comments. One thing I do feel fairly certain saying about the chap was that he was a big influence on Munch, who became enamoured with the philosopher's work during his time in Germany. He even painted a portrait of Nietzsche under commission from Ernst Thiel, a wealthy patron who was responsible for translating many of the philosopher's works following his death. In this piece, we can see Nietzsche in a similar setting to The Scream, standing on a bridge overlooking nature, though if he's screaming in horror, he hides it well. Painted in the expressive manner of saturated, conflicting colours and flowing, unreal shapes, the philosopher nonetheless looks reserved, staring out over the valley below, perhaps contemplating nature and its beauty as he was known to do, or maybe just trying to hold it all together. The building in the background is, like his mood, uncertain. It may be a town, a factory, even a church, or perhaps it represents a mental asylum and the looming threat of madness Nietzsche, like Munch, faced. This work conveys Munch's vision of Nietzsche's philosophy. It is an ideas picture, as Thiel adorably put it, conveying not just a likeness of the man, but some semblance of his philosophy as well. A task which Munch was better suited to than almost anyone else, as he and Nietzsche were very similar in more than one way. Both were gifted, though faced opposition in their respective fields, which they both pretty much ignored, producing their works without being constrained by the conventions or tastes of their peers. Both shared a pathological fear of death and disease, as well as the ever-looming threat of mental instability, and they also had similarly disastrous love lives. This makes it a crying shame that despite being contemporaries, the pair never met, as I'm sure they would have had much to talk about. Munch's affinity for Nietzsche is, however, illustrative of Nietzsche's impact on modern art, which is comparable to that of other major figures like Freud, Jung and Joyce, but also of a wider move within the visual arts towards incorporating ideas from beyond its traditional bounds. Ideas that, like Nietzsche's, were part of the fin de siècle zeitgeist, from the importance of subjective thought and abstract thinking, to notions of scientific determinism, and even mysticism and the occult, which were quite popular at the time, and would themselves play a big role in developments to come. While Munch was by now a successful painter, financially secure enough to be enjoying himself discussing Nietzsche with his mates in cafes all day, he was still not all that successful when it came to matters of the heart, and he stumbled from one disastrous relationship to the next, which in this case happened to be with one Tulla Larsson, the daughter of a wine merchant who had taken quite the shine to him, although the feeling may not have been exactly mutual. Whether or not Tulla realised this, she for her part was adamant on marriage, yet Munch remained apathetic, spending months pretty much on the run, avoiding her by travelling around Europe, only to be invariably pursued wherever he went. When the couple were together, things were seemingly no better. They frequently argued and shared little, it seems, but a love of drinking. Their relationship ended dramatically in a very strange incident, one which, like all the best stories, is short on details and has quite a few conflicting accounts. So the story goes, or at least the most entertaining version of it does anyway. Tulla sent word she was sick. And not just any old sick, but deathly sick, and needed to see the object of her affections one last time. This was, as it happens, a ruse, cooked up by Tulla and her mates to coax the otherwise cavalier Munch into making a marriage proposal. Upon his arrival at the purported deathbed, Munch, being a bit of an expert in such matters from years of experience, soon deduced the deception, upon which Tulla produced a pistol and threatened suicide if he were to leave her. Now, the exact mechanics of what happened next are unclear, but in the ensuing confusion of Munch's efforts to dissuade her, he somehow managed to shoot off a piece of his finger on his left hand. Safe to say that after this event, the wedding was off. Now, Munch did indeed get shot in the finger, but the rest of this is very much up for debate. Another version has it that he simply refused to go shopping one day, choosing instead to sit around drinking himself into oblivion on cognac, as you do. And during this all-day drinking session, he accidentally shot himself whilst fiddling with the revolver. Obviously the first version is a bit more flattering, but either way, Munch now had a physical scar to match his mental ones. The drinking, which seems to be part of his relationship with Tulla no matter who you ask, is another expression of Munch's increasing difficulty in coping with life as he got older. A fan of a drink since his days with the Bohemians in Christiania, what began as cans with hands had, over time, turned into addiction and even dependence. On top of this, when he had a few scoops in him, the otherwise reserved and quiet Munch was often given to fighting, getting into brawls with strangers, and on one notable occasion with the painter Ludwig Karsten, a rather embarrassing incident which he of course memorialised in paint years later. Now, Munch was quite tall and probably had some pretty good reach, but as a middle-aged man with a drinking problem, a career change from painter to boxer was probably not on the cards. And so, facing increasing difficulties in just keeping himself upright, as he put it, he would eventually seek help. After a particularly heavy bout of drinking in Copenhagen in 1908, which left him medically as well as figuratively paralytic, he decided on the advice of his old friend Emanuel Goldstein to check himself into a sanatorium for treatment. There, under the care of one Dr. Daniel Jacobson, he spent 8 months drying out and receiving treatments ranging from psychological care to dietary advice, to, much like the cities of the era, undergoing a process termed electrification, which doesn't really sound like much fun at all. The results, however, appeared successful, and after his stay, Munch showed a huge improvement. Upon his release from the hospital, he returned permanently to his native Norway, purchasing land on a house at Asgardstrand, where he had spent many of his summers. There he would live in relative isolation for the rest of his life, following Dr. Jacobson's parting advice, which had been to avoid socialising with all but good friends and to cut down on the drinking. Both prescriptions which Munch would follow from then on, withdrawing more and more from public life for both the sake of his health and his sanity. The second half of Munch's life, for atypically of a monk he lived a very long life, is often said to be less artistically important than his output before his 1908 breakdown, and this is to some extent true. Suffering, as Munch astutely understood, was the fuel for his work, and after his recovery he thankfully had a lot less of that. The price he paid, however, for his renewed mental strength was his ever-increasing isolation from the rest of the world. To say that these later works are not up to scratch, however, would be a massive injustice. Despite his isolation, he continued to create a huge amount of work that often differs vastly from his earlier efforts. The death and misery that had preoccupied him until now, while not entirely gone from his palette, are at the very least much less frequent. Replacing them are scenes of his beloved Asgardstrand, and the surrounding farms, forests and shores. His work didn't suffer from much regression either. Pieces like this one, known by the somewhat on-the-nose title of The Yellow Log, in some regards look so modern that they could well have been painted by a contemporary painter today. Its combination of strong colour contrasts and flat space, offset by an exaggerated perspective on the central log, creates a work full of tension which simultaneously exudes a kind of still serenity that Munch, like Nietzsche, drew from the contemplation of nature. Other subjects of this time include workers at local factories, farm life and horses, visiting friends and acquaintances, as well as the many models who came to him to be painted. Munch had made many studies of the human form, both for his works and for practice throughout his life, and he kept it up during these later years. He also, in addition to the more traditional models, made some rather unusual works featuring nude bathers at a local beach. He had, some years prior, made some studies of swimmers, but the brushwork and colour harmonies in some of these later ones are masterful, showing just how much practice and effort he had put into his craft. He even had a go at some of the new art forms that had emerged over the course of his lifetime, such as his experiments with photography, where he toyed with the medium and its possibilities, such as double exposures, and even tried his hand at a bit of cinema. The few shaky clips I've been using throughout this video were actually recorded by Munch himself, who you would swear was still on the drink considering how all over the place they are. This was more or less how he spent his days, going from being an international traveller to a stay-at-home shut-in, the most exciting incident to befall him apparently being a run-in with a neighbour's vicious dog, which resulted in a string of passive-aggressive letters and of course some charming paintings of the canine in question. All in all, however, the decision to withdraw from public life seems to have done him quite a lot of good. This withdrawal, while prudent, came at a rather inopportune time, as it coincided with him finally gaining recognition as an important artist in his homeland, a status marked by him being chosen to carry out a series of murals for Christiania's university, which, uncharacteristically for Munch, are bright, cheerful, hopeful, and feature prominently the motif of the sun. Always look on the bright side, as Dr. Jacobson may have advised, or stick with Apollo, as Nietzsche may have counselled. He also completed a series of works featuring female workers for the women's canteen at the Frieze Chocolate Company, under commission from the company's CEO, Johann Holst. Holst, most unusually for the era, seems to have shown basic human compassion for his workers, and sought to use art to give back something of what the machine had taken, as he put it. He commissioned art from many modern artists for his workers, perhaps picking up on the same thought Nietzsche had of a more expressive art being required in the face of mechanization. He even instituted a 48-hour work week in place of the prior work until you die of exhaustion model, long before such a policy was legally put in place, so fair play to Johann. While these commissions reflect Munch's at long last achieved goal of artistic recognition in his homeland, most of his output during his later years was of a more personal character. He returned once again to many of the themes and motifs he had painted before, painting even more versions of them, with new versions of works like Ashes and The Sick Child, among others, being produced as late as 1927. By and large, however, these works are said to lack the emotional intensity of his works from before his breakdown, though perhaps with the exception of the self-portraits he continued to produce until the end of his life. Munch had started with self-portraits as a young man, and he kept up the practice throughout his life. Viewed in sequence, they show us his transformation from a talented young man, painting in the naturalistic style, to the established modern painter with brushes confidently in hand. Later, there is the vision of the cosmopolitan sophisticate, the brushes substituted for a cigarette, and then the anguished figure of the same erudite man existing in what appears to be, as the title proclaims, hell itself. His later self-portraits chart a course of increasing pain. He paints himself suffering from the Spanish flu, the same disease that had carried off Sheila and so many others, but which he luckily survived. In another work, he depicts himself suffering from an eye disease, which is made intimidatingly present by a menacing black form that occludes half the canvas as it did his vision. The most striking of all his later works, in my opinion at least, is one of these portraits, titled Self-Portrait Between the Clock and the Bed, which gives us a vision of a frail old man who stands awkwardly, almost apologetically, in his final days. This canvas combines many motifs we've seen throughout his vast collection of work, from the expressive figures cut by his sloping shoulders and the hollow expression suggesting weariness of heart and soul, to the unnatural colour contrasts used throughout that evoke emotional turmoil. Standing, as the title describes, between the clock and the bed, implying the ever closer reality of death he faces, the figure of Munch feels uncomfortably placed, as if he occupies space he should not, standing apart from the rest of the world, as the man himself had found it necessary to do so in life. This gives us an impression of a man who had, from his youth to his old age, in many regards held himself back, as he put it, from the dance of life. Unable to form connections or to overcome the deep psychological scars of his youth. We see here the results. A tired old man, apart from us all, and yet in some ways, his frail, upright form conveys an unusual determination, strength drawn from his lifetime of work, a vast collection of art which hangs all around him. This was how Munch spent his final days, in relative isolation surrounded by his work. Increasingly isolated, his tendency to treat them like family became ever more pronounced, leading to many of the rumours and accounts of him taking the paintings on day trips or bringing prints out for tea, odd behaviours that, at this stage, are perhaps understandable, lacking as he did any other outlet for his emotional or social needs, but his art. He did indeed have real, non-paint-based families still alive, and he did keep in touch with them by writing, even supporting some of them financially. But he chose never to actually see them, perhaps fearing what interacting with others could mean for his still fragile mental health. In 1940, however, any hopes Munch may have had for a family reunion were precluded altogether by the Nazi occupation of Norway, which left him even more isolated than he had been before, if such a thing were even possible. The Nazis, as you might well know, were no fans of modern art nor modern artists like Munch, and their invasion represented a very real threat to him and his life's work, which he responded to by becoming even more of a shut-in, spending his remaining years living in fear of a knock on the door and the seizure of his works under the Nazis' cultural pogrom against so-called degenerate art. A supreme irony, considering it had been in Germany itself that Munch had made his name. The knock never came, however, and the old painter and his collection of work remained thankfully unmolested. Perhaps the Nazis felt the aggro of dragging an elderly and well-respected national treasure from his home wasn't worth the bad PR, and following his death they even gave him a full Nazi funeral, though Munch himself was no Nazi and never professed any inclination for their disastrous ideology. Their decision to do this is rather telling, if you ask me, for by this stage Munch and his works were so prevalent, influential and well known that no ill-conceived artistic jihad could ever have been successful, thanks in large part to the Nazis' own countrymen, many of whom, in the interceding decades, had taken the works of Munch to heart. Max Beckmann, Otto Dix, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, and Kate Kollwitz, as well as collectives such as the Blue Rider or Die Bruch, to name a few, with many others from across Europe like Wassily Kandinsky and Paul Klee, all taking inspiration from Munch and his expressive, introspective works. This is why I said way back at the start that Munch was not as alone as he may have seemed as he faced the end. For his artwork's expression of the deepest anxieties of his soul that had held him back from so much in life had also become the bridge he needed to connect him to others. Munch's art is, at the end of the day, very human. We can all relate to works like The Scream, The Sick Child, or the many moments from the Frieze of Life without any prior knowledge, and intuitively understand their meanings. This bare essential humanity that Munch displayed in his works would prove at long last his most meaningful connection to others, and would offer a path of resistance for artists to make work that explored what it meant to be human in an ever more inhuman modern world. Next time, we'll be returning to the hotbed of decadency, degeneracy, and periodic cultural apocalypses that is Fin de Siècle Vienna, to look at one more painter of the period who, like Munch, would fly the flag for a more human art. The expressionist painter that refused to be called an expressionist, Oskar Kokoschka, who, much like Munch, lived a long life full of strange art, stranger political statements, and a particularly bizarre incident involving an elderly butler, an all-night drinking session, and a life-sized doll made in the image of the wife of the composer Gustav Mahler, which really does have to be seen to be believed. So I hope you'll join me then, and thanks for watching.